This program is brought to you in part by the Royal Bank of Canada, serving Canadians for 126 years, one customer at a time. Hello and welcome to a special edition of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Bill McQueen. Over the years on DNET, we've regularly taken the pulse of the electronic and entertainment media and the way they represent people with disabilities. On today's program, we have an update, but from a different perspective. Media images developed in the United States have an enormous influence internationally on the way people are portrayed. Today's show was originally taped for the PBS station in Houston, Texas. It's part of a series titled Real Life. It features a panel of 3 journalists who've been following the disability movement in that country. Joe Shapiro is the senior editor of U.S. News and World Report and the author of No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movement, published by Times book Random House. Cindy Jones is publisher of Mainstream Magazine, a U.S. magazine serving people with disabilities. And George Covington, who is a press assistant to former U.S. Vice President Dan Quayle. Leading the discussion is Lex Frieden, project executive of the Independent Living Research Utilization Program in Houston.
Joe, do you believe the media fairly portrays people with disabilities?
It's a mixed bag, Lex. Without a doubt, the media have tremendous influence, tremendous ability to determine images of disability, positively, negatively. One of the most common sources of disability images are the charity telethons. Non-disabled people love telethons. Disabled people often hate them. Why? Because historically, telethons have portrayed people with disabilities as needy, sick, dying. They do this in order to get viewers to feel sorry for people with disabilities, to open up their hearts and open up their wallets. But disabled people say that those depictions have played no small part in the fact that disabled people have a 66% unemployment rate. And when you think about it, if you were an employer, would you hire somebody who you thought of as always needing the help of somebody else? Probably not. On the other hand, the press and the media televised this disability revolution that's going on. The signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, that was televised live on CNN. People from Texarkana to Timbuktu saw that. They saw disabled people saying that their problems were problems of discrimination. That was positive and that was powerful.
George, do you think it's just the telethons that are the problem?
The problem is historic. Since the days of the penny press, it's been very easy for the media, particularly the print media in the beginning, to portray us in either one of 2 ways. The poor, pathetic creature of charity, which Joe has adequately portrayed, and the other end was the super crip. If we do what everyone else does normally, we're portrayed as being just so abnormal that it's unbelievable. The media has the ability, and has unfortunately in this century, created the most negative images, myths, and stereotypes about disability than probably any other group, and we're still fighting to overcome that.
Give us a couple of your favorite examples.
Some semantics that I've talked about on a number of occasions. Bound to wheelchair. That is still in the press today. You'll see it regularly. And what I've told hundreds of journalists across the country, across the years, is if you ever say bound to a wheelchair, you better be talking about kinky sex, because it has nothing to do with disability. In my particular instance, I'm legally blind. I've seen myself referred to as in a world of darkness. So many images that evoke less than perfect eyesight. Well, I don't have perfect eyesight, that's true, but the sad thing is the media generally portrays me as though I'm an escapee from a Gothic novel. And you don't progress within a culture if you're always portrayed as a victim of. And you'll see that in the press on a daily basis. Nothing is new. It goes back, as I say, to the days of the penny press. The problem is the electronic media can pick that up and put it in everyone's home, and suddenly you don't look at us as human beings. You don't understand that we can lie, cheat, and steal, be fools, fakes, and frauds just like everybody else, except we have a disability.
Now, Cindy, you publish a magazine for people with disabilities. Do you feel like you have to compensate for the deeds of the mainstream press?
No, what we try to do is we try to give people with disabilities a place where they can have refuge from the other media. And what that means is we talk straight across to people with disabilities. I think in the regular press you're going to either be talking like we're on the mountaintop, we're, inspirational, or else we're these poor, helpless critters that you need to give money to. I think our magazine, what we try to do is talk directly across to people so that they can see, yeah, this is me, this is who I am, and this is my community. I think it's empowering when people feel like they're not alone, and that doesn't mean you have to necessarily go to a community center, but just knowing that your ideas are not unique, that other people feel and think the same way you do.
When we come back, has there been progress?
Joe, I can remember not too long ago when a group of people with disabilities were protesting a local movie theater because it didn't have a ramp. And there were maybe 100 people with disabilities marching around in front of this theater. And at the same time, there was one of those telethons that you described on. And both of those stories made it in the Society page the next day. Can you tell me why the editor didn't treat the protest like they would have treated a protest by any other racial group or ethnic group or group with differences?
I think that probably most editors do not understand that disabled people now see themselves as facing discrimination. Often they will identify themselves as part of a minority group, the group of people with disabilities. The press historically has treated disability as a feature story. That's changing now. It's changed a lot since the battle for the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. We've seen a great leap forward, I think, in the coverage of disability. We have shows like this one. We have columnists for papers in major cities around the country who write specifically on disability issues. We're seeing a broadening of issues of disability, and it reflects the culture. Journalists don't lead revolutions. We observe revolutions. We hold a mirror to society. As disabled people themselves have come to change their self-image and see themselves as facing discrimination as a bigger issue than their own disability. That is, somebody's attitudes or discrimination will hold a disabled person back more than the person's own physical or mental limitation. That's this new thinking of the disability rights movement. As that's happened, reporters have picked that up.
George, do you see progress occurring?
Progress is occurring. One example is Friends Who Care, which is a program of Easter Seals, which has gone into 30,000 elementaries and high schools trying to provide materials that show people with disability as just people. It's got to start with the young. I'm a former journalism professor, and I know that the general public have these views, and they don't leave them at the door of the journalism school when they come there as students. They go out as journalists and they put them back into the system. It's a cyclical system that we have to break.
Cindy, do you share those perceptions?
I think when kids grow up knowing that their friend has a disability in their kindergarten or first grade, I think it changes their attitudes, and their attitudes have to be shaped from beginning. I think that in the past when disabled kids were in special school, I mean, you emerge at 18 and all of a sudden, where did all these disabled people come from? How do I interact with these people? I think that the schooling is a good point to start.
One concern that I have, Joe, relates to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which you mentioned, and there is a feeling among some of us who are amateur media specialists that the press relates best to controversy, and that if you're doing something that's normal that people ought to be expected to do, then you're probably relegated back to those society pages again. It occurs to me that with the ADA in the mainstream press now, that the media might try to make something out of the controversy that surrounds a few critics of the bill. Do you think that's apt to happen?
I think that's true, Lex. That's probably a weakness that we have in the media. We do respond to controversy that can be used to get the disability message across. We did often find compelling stories in disabled people talking about how the system often worked against them, how laws were often antiquated and hurt them. But it's true that sometimes we will respond to the criticism of the ADA. There's a lot of misunderstanding, as you know, about what the Americans with Disabilities Act requires businesses and governments to do.
We'll be back in a moment when our panel takes a look at the entertainment industry. I'd
like to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the entertainment media. I know that many people with disabilities believe that in the entertainment media there's as much harm done as good by some of the characters who are portrayed in recent motion pictures like perhaps Rain Man or Forrest Gump. What's your view of that?
Well, I think that Son of a Woman was a good example of how it showed this guy who was pretty competent, and all of a sudden he's blind and he's incompetent. I think that the people with visual impairments that I know aren't that way, and it seemed to me that it put people with vision impairments back a step when they saw this.
He was a worthless creep. I kept wishing he'd blow his brains out. I had nothing to do with his being blind. He was a worthless, obnoxious, just absolutely venal creep before he lost his eyesight.
He was portrayed as angry and suicidal. I mean, what does that say to other people out there, that people who are blind should be suicidal? I mean, I think it's an awful image, and I think that most people aren't that way when they become disabled. I think there's an attitude in society that says, I'd rather be dead than disabled. Well, I think that if we put that on the table, we can say, well, is this true? I think most people with disabilities I know would not rather be dead than disabled. They have a fairly productive life. They have families and are educated. Some of them are lucky enough to have jobs and get out of the government benefits package that is a trap. But I think that most people would, are glad they're alive, and I think that that needs to be portrayed in the media as well. Those images of just leading a normal life don't really come across. It's either you're one extreme or the other, and I think the middle road really has to be portrayed.
Joe, don't you think, however, that by portraying people with disabilities as being bad as well as being good, some frustrated as well as not, that we are in fact serving reality?
If it's done to serve reality, I think what disabled people often dislike about these movie portrayals, and this is what Cindy was talking about, often in literature, in movies, the fact that someone has a disability is used as a symbol of their evilness, of the fact that they're evil, or it's used as reason to explain why they're bitter and angry. I think of the villains in the Batman movies who are angry and out to get the world because they have this disability. That's actually a device in literature that goes back to Shakespeare and probably earlier.
It's not only motion pictures that are beginning to perceive people with disabilities in different lights, but it's also the mainstream television shows. Murphy Brown has a piece with a disabled person on it from time to time. Cindy, what's your view of that?
Well, I think that it's good that people with disabilities need to be cast as in roles of disabled people. I think that there's places, what I call them roll-ons in Murphy Brown, where someone just rolls across the stage. And we would like to see what's called nondescript roles, meaning that it doesn't say a person with a disability, it's just the secretary, or it's just the receptionist or the doctor. I think that there's been some parts for Alan Toy, who is a wheelchair user, and he's played some nondescript roles.
Now, are we to believe that all those actors who show up either in bit parts or in big parts are really people with disabilities?
No, and that's a real problem. It seems to me that not only when there is a specific role for a person with disabilities, people with disabilities aren't necessarily cast in those roles, which means that that's one fewer part that someone can play. But it also doesn't mean that the set has to change, that the directors have to change. I mean, when someone with a disability enters any situation, it changes the situation. It makes it more real, and so we would like to see more realism in television and movies and all media, and that means bringing people with disabilities to play those roles.
But isn't that the actor's job, to play a role? And George, what difference does it make if it's an actor playing a role, whether they're disabled or not?
The difference is, I think that an actor should be able to play any damn role they want to play. That's fine. But when they will go out of their way to find an able-bodied actor when there are disabled actors who could play that role, that's one thing. But the other cop-out is this. The reason they don't want a lot of those, quote, disabled people around is their sets aren't accessible. They don't want to make scenes accessible. They don't want to be like the rest of life is supposed to be, accessible. If they want their fantasy, that's fine. If they can make a castle and blow it up, they can make a damn ramp that goes into the castle.
Good point.
I'd like to add another thing, and that's about the Academy Awards. You can always predict who's going to win the Academy Award. Look for the actor who plays the part of a disabled person. And this goes back, Coming Home with John Voight, Christy Brown, it was My Left Foot, Son of a Woman, Al Pacino.
Dustin Hoffman and
Rain Man.
But those were 4 movies that portrayed very positive depictions of disability. And those succeeded because you had four of the best actors in the world.
Exactly.
And if you insisted that those roles had been played by people with disabilities, would you have those movies have the power that they had?
Maybe not. But I mean, Marlee Matlin won an Academy Award because
that's
she
right.
was...
Exactly. Of course, I think Harrison Ford could probably betray me fairly well, and I wouldn't want an incompetent blind actor doing me. But that's different.
When we come back, our media panel looks at developments in the areas of captioning, descriptive video, and advertising.
I'd like you all to take a look at this and give me your opinion about this particular news spot. I think it's interesting that, for effect, that particular piece was done with scripting and subscripting so that people who couldn't read sign language could see what it said. But George, you had a problem with that particular spot, didn't you?
Beside the fact that I couldn't find the monitor, but I pretended to look, you'll notice. Yes, the visually impaired people in this country are roughly 14 million who have a substantial vision loss that can't be significantly corrected. Only a few of those are blind. Only probably 500,000 to 1.5 million are legally blind. The rest are you people, but you simply don't see as well as you think you do. Television does not take into account any of that except through those programs, and there are some now coming online for audio descriptions, but I'm certain that the people at this table will tell me more than what I missed, so I don't feel that you should have made it totally accessible
Yeah,
to me.
setting aside the fact that there is no audio on that particular scripted presentation, Cindy, what's your view of that?
I thought it was really nice. I felt like it was inclusive, and I think if I was hearing impaired, I'd feel like they cared about me. I think it was tastefully done and not patronizing. I think it was straight across, and I thought it was a good piece.
Now, the interesting thing about that is that they're actually trying to promote watching their news, not only among people with hearing impairment, but among the mainstream population. The people without disabilities see that, and I think their advertising agency will tell them that they will view Channel 11 in that case as being more sensitive, more concerned, more interested in everybody than some of the other channels. Joe, do you think that's true?
I think clearly that's the image they want to bring across, and I think that's probably an effective commercial for doing that. I've noticed that recently one of the major aspirin companies is also using a commercial where they have a woman who's a teacher of deaf students and she signs. It's actually very effective when you have the television on and then suddenly you have 30 seconds of silence. It does focus your attention on the screen.
I guess it was 1977 at the White House Conference on Handicapped Individuals that I first heard the suggestion that advertisers ought to use people with disabilities mopping the floor and using shine and wax just like everybody else. That's actually beginning to happen today, isn't it, Cindy?
Right, and I think one of the best examples was in 1984 with the Olympics in Los Angeles. Levi Strauss did maybe it was a 5-second spot because they were doing all these clips. One of the guys was walking down the boardwalk with his girlfriend and he flipped up on his back wheels, did a 360 spin, got back down. That was it. It was real short. And Levi Strauss got more response on that 3 to 5 second spot than anything else they'd done. It's interesting that it wasn't for maybe another 5 years later then you started seeing McDonald's come online, Target come online with ads. They've all reported very positive response to very little bit of portrayal of people with disabilities. It can just be a very slight glimmer, and yet what happens is they get a tremendous amount of letters and calls, and I think people respond to it well. Actually, the mainstream advertising has been in advance of the mainstream press, I think.
That's right, Lex. I think the television advertising probably has the best depictions of people with disabilities of any media. The reason is that disabled people, as more go to college and get jobs, they have consumer power. And businesses realize that. And when they put disabled people in commercials, they get response.
I think the other issue, too, is not just the person with a disability, but it could be their parent. A lot of the letters come from parents or spouses. So when you look at 49 million people with disabilities, you might be actually talking about half of the population of the U.S. by the time you add significant others or family members.
George, I guess that's the truth. Disability is not just the few of us who may be people with disabilities who are evident to society, but millions of others.
No, and that's a sad thing, too, because I've recently been spending a lot of my time talking about the concepts of universal design, not just for buildings, but for products and services, because right now the baby boomers are hitting the brick walls of 50, and as they do that, they don't hear as well or see as well or move as fast. And they start applying those negative images, myths, and stereotypes to themselves. You'll see hundreds of thousands of people in this country today who will not leave their apartments, their homes. They are recluse because suddenly they have developed a small disability, or what we would consider a small disability, and they can't deal with it.
We're drawing near the end of our program, and what I'd like to ask you to share with the viewers is just one or two thoughts from each of you about what we can do to improve the way people with disabilities are portrayed by the media. George?
Basically, I'd say start with the young journalist and simply educate the public to understand, from an old satirist from years ago, we have met the enemy and he is us. The disability community is no different than the general community. We are you, and you, more than likely, are going to be us sooner or later.
Joe?
The more coverage of disability issues, the better journalists learn when they do reporting. The other thing is we need to realize that when we talk about disabled people, we're not talking about some isolated group off in a corner. The things we do for people with disabilities ends up helping all of us.
Cindy?
You need to get to know people, and as you have a relationship with someone, you understand their issues, and you understand it from their point of view rather than just what you perceive their point of view to be.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you, George Covington, Joe Shapiro, and Cindy Jones for being our guest here today.
By the way, Mainstream Magazine is published monthly. Abilities Magazine, Ability Network, and Disability Today are 3 Canadian magazines which cover issues affecting people with disabilities. In Canada, many organizations publish newsletters and provide information. Shapiro's book, No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movement in the United States, is considered an excellent overview of the disability rights movement in that country. How do you think the media is faring in describing our lives and telling our stories? Please write to us. Our address is coming right up. And that's our show for this week. I'm Bill McQueen. See you again next week. You can write to us at Disability Network, CBC Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's Disability Network, CBC Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. Or you can fax us at area code 416-205-3399. This program is brought to you in part by the Royal Bank of Canada, serving Canadians for 126 years, one customer at a time.